Who do you take first? Who are the best sleepers to draft? How do you build a team that's going to win? Look, all that is important, but just as important sometimes are the things you don't do in your fantasy football draft. These are the top 10 mistakes even experienced fantasy football players make that you need to avoid.
If you can't wait to start drafting fantasy football teams, you don't have to. Underdog Fantasy has drafts going on all offseason with tons of unique and fun formats. Not to mention their flagship Best Ball Mania 5, where one lucky winner will become a millionaire. Plus, they already have pick'em lines ready for week 1 of the NFL season and their new streak format where you can win 1,000 times your entry. Just go to UnderdogFantasy.com and sign up using promo code ENDGAME to get a special pick'em that you can't get anywhere else, plus up to $250 in bonus cash.
These aren't in any particular order, but let's go ahead and start with the first mistake you want to avoid.
Yeah, number 1 is not knowing your league settings. And I actually think this might be the most important one. It sounds really simple, right? Like, yeah, I know my league, it's PPR, whatever. But I mean, really understand your league. I made this mistake early on when I started playing fantasy football many years ago. I didn't really know my league settings that well. I just went out, found some, draft guide online and just followed it blindly. And I finished in last place for the only time ever in fantasy football. But as I got more experience and started learning about it, I started paying more attention to my leagues. Not just the scoring like PPR, half PPR, but your roster requirements. How many running backs do you start? How many wide receivers, flexes, tight ends? Does the scoring benefit one position or the other? Is it balanced? How many bench spots do you have? I mean, there's a lot of stuff here that really matters. And if you're really sharp and you really understand your league, you can take advantage of it and really outdraft your opponents. Where on the flip side, if you don't understand your league, if you're like, yeah, it's a fantasy football league, whatever, yeah, you're probably going to draft a team and then wonder, why is my team not very good? So really important that you go in, look at your league settings, understand the scoring, understand the rosters, benches, everything, so you can take advantage on draft day.
Number 2, not being flexible during your draft. Look, sometimes this comes back to bite the ones who do the most research and feel like they're the most prepared, and you have those rankings, maybe your own rankings, the ADP, all this burned into your mind. You know where you're going to pick. You feel like you know who you're going to get in what rounds. And then the actual draft comes and it all goes out the window because the other people in your league are not doing what you expected, right? The ADP, forget it, right? It's gone. The guy you think is going to be there isn't there. And then you don't know what to do. So you have to be willing to adapt. You can't go in saying, I'm going to take 2 running backs in the first 3 rounds, or I'm definitely going to get, my tight end by round 6. Even if that is true, and even if that's possible, you can't have that mindset. You always have to be willing to adapt because you never really know what's going to happen on draft day, even if you know all the guys in your league.
And then number 3 is just blindly obeying ADP. Kind of plays off what you just said. Like, don't just look at the guys at the top of the ADP and feel like you have to take one of those guys. I am all for reaching on players you like. Now, don't reach, multiple rounds ahead. If a guy is going much later in the draft, you can wait a little bit to get him. But if there's somebody you like a little bit later in the draft, don't wait to take him. Take him. It's fantasy football. You're not going to get every pick right. So you might as well at least like the picks you make. Because the problem is if you wait, if you try to get cute and say, hey, I'm going to push the envelope and really wait here and try to get the guy in the next round, a lot of times he doesn't come back to you in the next round and you end up missing out on him. And then if he ends up being a league winner, you're kicking yourself all season long. I wouldn't reach more than a round, maybe a round and a half for a guy. But if there is somebody you really like in that range and they're not at the top of the ADP, it's okay. You can take them. Nobody's going to make fun of you for reaching on that player, especially if that player is great and is winning you a fantasy championship.
Number 4, don't reach just to fill a position. Zero RB, anchor RB, or cure RB, whatever you want to call it, those have become popular strategies over the last few years. And some people, we hear it all the time, are just like, that's ridiculous. You can't win that way. You can't ignore running back. It's the most important position. I have to have a starting running back before I start getting my 4th and my 5th receiver. Even though it's been proven that those strategies do work if done correctly. And you don't have to have a quarterback and a tight end and fill out your starting lineup before you start filling, let's say receiver or flex or other spots. It doesn't have to go that way. You take the value where it falls. You don't have to get a top 10 player at every single position because you don't know how those guys are going to finish by the time the year is over. So yeah, I know balance is important to some extent, But at the end of the day, you want to take the best players, period, regardless of position.
And number 5, kind of along with that, trying to win each position. You don't have to have the best QB, the best running back 1, the best wide receiver 1, the best tight end 1. Also, who is going to be the best at each position? How often is the guy that's drafted as the number 1 player at a position finish as the number 1 player? Like, far less often than you think. There's no guarantee that if you get, Sam Laporta this year, you have the number 1 scoring tight end. Or if you get Josh Allen this year, you have the number 1 scoring QB. So don't force these positions into your lineup early just so you can have what you think is the number 1 scoring at the position, because sometimes guys come out of nowhere. Like, look, last year, if you had gotten CJ Stroud, Jordan Love, Brock Purdy, if you had gotten these guys late in the draft, you had a bigger advantage than the person who had Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts. So don't feel like you have to have the number 1 player at each position. Like you said, Pierre, take the best players when they're available. Take the value when it's available. You'll be fine. Do you want to win your fantasy league but don't have time to do all the research? Are you tired of drafting mediocre teams and then having to constantly hope you hit it big on the waiver wire just to compete? Do you wish you could have a fantasy expert like Pierre or myself with you while you draft? Well, now you can. With our app DraftLane and our live draft pilot, we will guide you through every pick of your draft and tell you exactly which players we would pick if we were on the clock. Our proprietary algorithm will take into account your league settings, scoring, and roster requirements to identify the best picks every time you are on the clock to ensure you have a winning team from week 1. It's the closest thing you can get to having us there drafting with you. Get the biggest edge in fantasy football. Just go to your app store and search for DraftLane and download it today and get ready to dominate your draft.
And to piggyback on that, number 6, we all fall victim to this. Sometimes recency bias. Don't let it infiltrate your rankings and, be so influential when you're drafting that all you remember is what did this guy do last year? Well, guess what? It's not about last year anymore. It's what are they going to do this year? And history does not always repeat itself. In fact, at certain positions, it usually doesn't, like running back and, in fact, quarterback. Now, I will tell you, there are some players you can almost guarantee will be among the top at their position. Yeah, I feel pretty good. Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts will probably be among the top scoring quarterbacks. Pat Mahomes, too. But when it comes to guys at a position like running back or tight end, look, Sam Laporta was the tight end 1 last year. Doesn't mean he's going to be the tight end 1 this year. Remember how he was drafted last year? Nobody expected that. We thought Travis Kelce was still going to be the tight end 1, and he wasn't. Okay, so even though we do have to use last year as a guide, things are always different in the not for long league.
And then at number 7, kind of similar there, don't draft just based on name value. You're going to see names like DeAndre Hopkins, Alvin Kamara, other names that you've seen over the years that have been fantasy studs. And look, maybe they'll still be good this year, but you have to also understand situations aren't the same. They're not in the prime of their careers anymore. So don't feel like just because you recognize the name on the draft board, you need to take them. Like you said, not for long league. Things change fast in the NFL. We saw it last year with a guy like Austin Eckler. He's always the one that comes to mind. Went from being an absolute stud RB1 to looking like complete dust. So it can happen at any time. Obviously, older players are at more risk for that. I'm not saying don't ever draft those players, but don't feel like if you see them on the board, you need to reach for them just because you recognize the name. Name value doesn't score fantasy points.
And number 8 is probably my favorite one. Chris, earlier you mentioned not being a slave to the ADP and feeling like you have to go by the site's rankings or what everybody else is thinking. I say, just in general, don't bow to peer pressure. What I mean is, if people are talking down a certain player in your league, and it happens all the time, right? Doesn't mean you can't draft him. Don't feel like you're going to get ridiculed because you reach on a player or because you drafted a player or because, let's say there's a run on quarterbacks in round 4. Well, now you got to get in on that run. No, you don't. You should not care whatsoever about what each other team is doing during your draft. You focus on building your best team and you see how the draft board lies. All right. But again, you've got to focus on your projections, your predictions, your gut feelings sometimes, because this year, a lot of things that are going to happen, nobody will expect.
And then number 9, I didn't know this one even existed until we started doing mock drafts all year long, and that is drafting to trade somebody. So maybe drafting a number 2 high-end QB or a number two high end tight end when you already have a really good QB or a really good tight end, and then saying, I'll trade them during the season. That sounds great. And if you know you can trade them, then sure, that's great. But how often does that really work out where somebody's like so desperate for your number two QB that you're able to fleece them during the season, and this draft pick that has just been sitting on your bench ends up helping you out? What really ends up happening is you just have a quarterback scoring a bunch of points on your bench that you can't start week after week. And at some point, you got to make the decision, do I cut him or do I just continue to waste a bench spot on this quarterback? The most important thing in fantasy is your team. Don't worry about the other teams. Don't worry about your opponent. You can't play defense. You can't control how many points they score. You just can control putting together the best team you possibly can. And I think drafting a second QB or a second tight end when you already have an elite one is not the best way to do that.
And speaking of defense, number 10, this one probably is the biggest sign that you're a noob. Drafting a defense or a kicker too early. And by too early, I mean earlier than the last 2 rounds. If you're in a league that unfortunately uses both kicker and team defense, look, it's fine. It's pretty common still. Those two positions should be the last two that you pick. And I thought about digging into the stats here to prove my point. And then I realized it's kicker defense. It's not worth the time. Let me just point out, quickly an example. 2022, Daniel Carlson of the Raiders was the number 2 scoring kicker behind only Justin Tucker. And so he was drafted too high by a lot of people. And he finished as the number 25 kicker in fantasy last year. Why? Just because. That's how kickers are. It doesn't matter what they did last year. Just forget it. You're better off just taking whoever's left for you. Don't draft them any earlier than the end of your draft. Those are some mistakes we really hope you avoid on draft day. But if you want to know who you should take as far as the running back position, we got you covered. These are the only running backs you should really focus on in the early rounds.